Vietnam and Perspective Climate Research. My name is Axel Michaelova. I'm the Director of Perspective Climate Research, and I would like to pass on the floor to Pham Van Tan from Vietnam to give welcoming remarks.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Vietnam delegation, I would like to extend my warmest welcome to all of you to this side event, which is co-organized by Vietnam and Perspective Climate Groups. At this today's event, we will share Vietnam's current progress on the development of carbon market and its link to Article 6. Additionally, our esteemed speakers will present on the technicals of Article 6 regulation as well as on the approach of CDM transition, which is of the stumbling block of the negotiation process at COP26. I would like to thank Perspective Climate Groups for the coordination in co-organizing this very meaningful event in the context of negotiation on Article 6 entering critical stage, and we are looking forward to successful outcome of COP26. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. With this, I would like to set the scene of this event. So can you bring up the slides, please? Thank you very much. So the event will talk about Article 6 readiness and CDM transition. You know, of course, Article 6 is the key topic of negotiations here at the COP. And we've also heard a lot about the need for capacity building. So we want to discuss this from various angles, ranging from research to implementation on the ground. And I'm really happy that we have a very highly set panel today. So, of course, you have seen this graph, which was published by the UNFC Secretariat on where we stand regarding the sum of the NDCs. The picture is not pretty. The gap between the sum of NDCs and the pathway that is needed to reach the 2-degree or 1.5-degree is staggering. It's in the order of billions of tons of CO2 equivalent. That's why we need to increase ambition. And Article 6 is a very important approach to increase ambition. Because if Article 6 enables harnessing of the cheapest mitigation options worldwide, it means that those options are actually mobilized, and I would like to really stress one point. Many people think, oh, carbon markets are bad because they just catch the low-hanging fruit. The problem is these fruit, they may rot, and they need to be actually harvested. And the Article 6 will be crucial for harvesting these fruit. And of course, as we've seen in so many countries, agreeing on national emission targets in the context of an NDC is not easy. It requires political strength. There are many lobby groups who don't like emission reductions. So if there is access to carbon markets to reduce the cost of mitigation, then politically it will be much easier to agree on more stringent targets now and in the future. And of course, also one aspect is often completely forgotten. The rapid diffusion of mitigation technology through market mechanisms around the world will help bringing the costs of these technologies down. For example, one beautiful example in Vietnam is the use of photovoltaics. Vietnam has a very strong program for photovoltaic expansion. It expanded by several gigawatts in very few years. And the cost of the technology came down significantly. And carbon markets can be extremely helpful. So to generate this virtuous circle of lower technology costs and more stringent national emission targets. And then regarding our second topic, CDM transition. Why is it important? It's important because it relates to the level of trust of participant. The CDM promised crediting periods of 3 times 7 years, meaning 21 years of getting the emission credits. For the programs of activities, it even meant 28 years, and for the forest project, even 60 years. In reality, what happened, there was a period of 7 years in which the CDM project developers could get revenues between 2005 and 2012. Ever since then, the market was dormant because the price had collapsed, the demand had collapsed. Now, there are many sitting in the negotiation hall who want to take away the remaining CDM credits by saying, oh, CDM is an old thing, it needs to be abolished, and now we start fresh with Article 6. So one needs to have a good understanding, and we'll have one presentation today that discusses a study that we at Perspectives Climate Research did about where are the CRs that have not been used and who will be hit most by a blanket limit of CR use under Article 6. There, of course, is the other thing that is being said, that transition of the CDM credits might undercut the ambition of the Paris Agreement. Of course, it's clear if units from the past come into the NDC period, there will be some loosening of the overall target. But of course, the beneficial impact of actually preserving the trust of the private sector that carbon market mechanisms can exist in the long run is probably much more important than this aspect. Then, of course, we will have one presentation by my old friend and long-standing colleague Regina Beetz on challenges that might reduce the ambition contribution. So, of course, if the rules for international carbon markets are insufficiently stringent, they will become a giant loophole. So this needs to be presented. I won't go through this. Regina will describe it very neatly. We have a very interesting product of our joint work that is coming up shortly. And of course, one important aspect is also the governance. Carbon market mechanisms can only thrive if the governance is good. And of course, at the very last point, I want to stress, if nobody wants to buy credits, then of course the carbon markets cannot function. So everything is dependent on credibility that will generate the demand. Just one idea, I will look at it very shortly. I know, again, Regina will look at it more closely. We've been doing some work lately where we looked at how the CDM methodologies can actually be made fit for Article 6. And we have a simple but hopefully effective approach, a so-called ambition coefficient, which serves as a multiplier that will be reduced over time as countries are scheduled to reach net zero. So it would reach zero at the time the country actually would have to get and fulfill the net zero target. So just a few thoughts, and here is now the agenda. So we will first start with Regina, who will talk about the carbon market regulation. Subsequently, we will look at transformational impacts of Article 6, a research project Perspectives has undertaken together with UNEP DTU. Then we will have a short glimpse into our CR ownership and the unused CR study I already mentioned. Then, of course, our colleagues from Vietnam will look into how could be a role for Article 6 in the context of the Vietnamese NDC implementation strategy. Then Karen will come in with some glimpses in ongoing work on how to develop a dynamic baseline for Article 6 in Vietnam, both linked to transformational impacts and, of course, the long-term ambition. And last but not least, we'll have a short comment from Arunabha Ghosh from the CEW in India, who have done some work also on CDM transition and very pointed conclusions from that. So without any further ado, I would now give the floor to Regina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Axel, and welcome also from my side. So my name is Regina Beetz. I'm from the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, and I'm going to present joint work with Axel and some other colleagues. Michael Mehling, I think, is also here, and Paula and Andrea Baranzini. So we are a large consortium, and we were working on a book which is looking not at all what can carbon markets do good, but we look at the challenges and how actually carbon markets had problems in the past and what could be done and how effective governance should look like for those carbon markets. So this project was funded by the SNIS Foundation, and so next slide. So what we find, and I think this is a topic which has been overlooked by many, is that carbon markets are on different layers. So we have them on the international layer where we are right now. We have them on national levels, like the European Emissions Trading Scheme. We even have them on subnational levels, like the Californian Cap and Trade Scheme. So we have different levels, and we have links between those levels. And so what you may be aware of is that, for example, CDM, CRs were able to be used for compliance in the European Emissions Trading Scheme. And so what is missing and what causes problem is that there is no oversight, no body which is then looking at that linkage. So what we, for example, found, just to illustrate what I mean, is that companies in Hungary were surrendering CDM credits, like CRs, to their government. And this government was, because they had enough for their own compliance under the Kyoto Protocol, were reselling those surrendered CRs again on the market. And at the end, they actually ended up again in the European Emissions Trading Scheme. So that's a way where we can see double claiming or double counting. And this is a problem because we have links between two systems, and there was no oversight and no rules making sure that there is not this double claiming happening. And for that, so we see these risks, and we see also other risks, like we've seen a lot of VAT fraud in the European Emissions Trading Scheme because there were borders there. We see money laundering, and so what we are asking for from a governance perspective is that we need robust registries and transaction logs which are made transparent, because for carbon markets to work, they need to have trust. People trading in these markets need to have trust, and transparency gives trust. We also need know your customer checks, for example, in order to avoid money laundering. We need robust accounting systems. So these are all things which need to be put in place before linking these different levels of carbon markets. So because this is an event on Article 6, I'm focusing my presentation today on baseline and credit systems, although our volume also covers cap and trade systems. The challenges for baseline and credit systems are quite substantial, because when you look at the incentives for the people and participants in the process, you will find out that they all have a kind of an incentive to overstate the credits created. So project and activity developers benefit from larger credit volumes, credit buyers want to low prices, and so they also have an interest in higher credit volumes, and also the host country might benefit, especially under the Kyoto Protocol, where they, under the CDM, they didn't have own targets, would be interested in having large credit sales, especially when they had hot air. And so this kind of setting with the interests leads to situations where there's a risk of abuses. Missing additionality or overstated baselines or poor verification, these are all things what we've seen in the markets and where governance need to be very robust in order to address them. So the picture on the right is also, again, an example how we illustrate our findings. So this is in the joint implementation market, and this is a special type of project. It's coal piles in the Ukraine. And what you see here are the dates when the national government was approving these project types. And on the other axis, you see the million tons of what was the volume of those. And under JI, there were 2 tracks, and track 1 gave the possibility for the host country to do basically everything themselves, verification, baseline, and so on. And what we see here is that after May 2012, when it was clear that there will be not more JI projects be able to be approved later on, like from 2000 and for the second commitment period, basically, then there were a lot of these types of projects put for approval with large volumes. And interestingly, these type of projects, you can't really find them in the CDM or other baseline and credit systems. It's very strange that they should only reduce emissions between 2008 and 2012. This is quite unlikely. I mean, these piles will be emitting methane even longer. And it also assumes that around 80% of the waste pile would burn, which is also a quite exaggerated assumption. So this just illustrates again what we've seen in some carbon markets, and that this is now an example for hot air selling, I would call it, from the Ukraine, that we need really strong oversight and governance, and that's why Article 6 and the rules there, the authorization is very important. And now to look into the future, our volume also explores what are the questions, what are the challenges for future carbon markets. And I just bring up what Axel was mentioning before. So for the world we are going to get into, which is a net zero world, the big question will be, how are we defining baseline in a net zero world? And so how will crediting be ambition? If we know a country has set a net zero target, we need more ambitious baselines in order to do any crediting of credits in the future. So the proposal, what Axel was showing before, is that there will be an ambition coefficient put on top, and that will basically be the reduction factor, which will be put in place in order to make sure that the baseline is ambition and the credits which are generated are in line with the net zero date. And if we then think even further, we will need to come up with negative targets in the future. And so there we will also need to think about what would be negative targets and how will the crediting and credit production be possible under negative targets. So we think there will be new questions, new decisions, rules to be put in place in order to ensure that this type of credits are then going to be sound. And so what we need to think about is how can we ensure that this date of net zero is not going to be influenced with the interest to have more credits. I think that's one of the crucial issues for this approach for setting an ambition coefficient. And now coming to the end, just to let you know, so there will be this volume, which is going to be published soon, open source. We're just waiting for the publisher to give us green light. And it's going to look at baseline credits, but also on cap and trade. It's a short volume, and I think it's worthwhile to read because it really brings together all things which went wrong in the past with carbon markets, and what we learned from it and how we should design them to make them more robust against these challenges. And there is a policy brief which is already to be downloaded, which summarizes some of these findings. And there's one other policy brief which looks into the future, what I just showed you in the last slide, and we'll illustrate that a little bit more. So this is policy brief 2. And then there is still our video around, which we presented in Madrid, which explains carbon trading under the negotiations for people without really definite knowledge before. So thanks a lot, and I hand over to Axel again.
Thank you very much, Regina, for setting the scene about carbon market regulation. We really try to make this accessible, so we'll spread it widely and hope that it will actually allow a good interaction also regarding the key challenges. I would now pass on to Stefan to look into the transformational impacts of Article 6. Stefan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Axel, and thank you also for hosting us. I will today present the results from a research project that Perspectives Climate Research conducted together with a UNEP-DTU partnership led by Karen Holm-Olsen, who will also speak today, and First Climate. And the subject was promoting transformational change through carbon markets. The project was generously funded by the German Environment Agency and tried to explore how carbon markets can lead to transformative impacts under the Paris Agreement. And so we explored the research question how transformational change can be promoted through Article 6, what kind of role regulatory and monetary incentives can play in driving transformation, but also looking at specific case studies and transformation characteristics in 3 countries, in Morocco, Costa Rica, and Pakistan. So we did a lot of literature analysis, case studies, and also several rounds of consultations. And the main results of this research project will be published earlier next year. We began by trying to get, an academically founded common understanding of what does it actually mean if you talk about transformational change through carbon markets, because the concept has been there, but it hasn't played a big role in carbon markets as such. So the definition we agreed on is a fundamental sustained change of a system that ends established high carbon practices and contributes to a zero carbon society in line with the Paris Agreement goal to limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees and the SDGs. So as I mentioned, there is already some methodology under the ICAT initiative that has looked at characteristics of transformational change that you see here. And I'm not going through the details now and jump directly to the application to Article 6. So it's clear that, of course, we are thinking about mitigation outcomes at scale that are also sustained over time. And that means, for instance, that we need to redefine, what are additional mitigation outcomes? How can we promote a shift to upscaled activities beyond projects and programs as we know them under the KP to also include the policy level, for instance? But of course, while carbon markets are focused on mitigation, it has always been a key objective of the instrument to also achieve sustainable development in host countries. And it has taken some time until we had, tools also on how to measure and operationalize that. And we think if we really want to achieve transformation, we need to enhance these tools and make sure we have good, robust MRV systems for sustainable SD impacts, which are then also allowing a market differentiation, meaning a higher price for projects or certificates with a higher SD contribution. Then, of course, technology change is really crucial. So we will need to think about how carbon markets can also harvest the high-hanging fruit, not only the low-hanging ones, but also the high-hanging ones, because the cheaper mitigation option increasingly needs to be used by the host country, actually, for its own NDC achievement, which is a fundamental paradigm shift compared to the incentive structure of the Kyoto carbon markets. And that means just that a lot of things need to be adjusted, such as crediting periods. We think that digitalization will be very important in this process, not only for MIV, but also potentially for payments to bring down transaction costs. The final point here on the transformation characteristics that I want to introduce, it's clear there's much more detailed background and knowledge, but I can only touch on that briefly now, is to look at baselines, because that is, of course, a crucial parameter that determines how many carbon credits are being generated by an activity. And it is one of the big discussion points also in the negotiations right now on how we can define new approaches to set baselines beyond the business as usual. So one option that is being discussed there are performance-based benchmarks for comparable technologies, but also a more dynamic way of baseline setting that also looks at, factoring in ex-post calculations prior to issuance rather than only looking at ex-ante estimations. And also, Axel already mentioned it, innovative approaches such as the ambition coefficient. And actually we'll hear about, a concept for that applied to the context of Vietnam later in Karen's presentation. So that is a very nice fit. This, of course, has practical implications. The incentive structure is different. If you're a project developer, you invest in a project, but you're supposed to get less carbon credits. Of course, you wonder, how can I make the investment work? Because carbon market projects, by definition, need to also be additional, which means they depend on the carbon revenue. And that means that there is a higher risk to some extent, which then in turn requires that there's a certain predictability about the expected revenues before you can take an investment decision. And of course, all of these new requirements also require capacity and therefore resources and technical assistance. And a concept that we didn't really have much in the Kyoto carbon markets is safeguards, institutional safeguards. And I'll go through that very quickly, but I think it's an important point. So we do need to have safeguards against negative impacts, against overselling, against perverse incentives, in particular in relation to the NDC. As I mentioned, we looked at 3 case studies. So we had identified a Article 6 pilot activity that is, even prior to formulating the rules, already beginning to plan implementation in Morocco for a project that seeks to convert organic waste to energy. In Costa Rica, there's a case study of a modal shift to non-motorized transport, which means biking and walking in 2 urban areas in the country. And in Pakistan, it is this policy instrument that I mentioned, where we were thinking about how Article 6 can be integrated into competitive renewable energy auctions. One clear finding also that we saw is that Article 6 piloting really is at design stage globally. As I mentioned, the rules are not finalized yet. So we don't really have a lot of projects that are already being implemented, and many of those projects are already thinking about how can we, generate new baseline approaches, but they haven't finalized their planning yet. So this is a challenge, and therefore, to come to the conclusions, it's clear that carbon markets are not an end in itself, but an instrument that should serve to increase ambition. Axel has explained that nicely. And so therefore, the transformational change concept requires also a practical incentive structure that, first of all, provides safeguards against negative impacts, but also then thinks about how we can incentivize the positive additional impacts beyond pure mitigation. And we do have a substantial toolkit and a knowledge base, but we need to update all of these key tools on additionality, on baseline setting, to meet these new participation requirements. And we also need to have some level of differentiation still by host country. It's very clear that due to this paradigm shift in the carbon market that I mentioned, that we're not only looking to identify low-hanging, but in particular the high-hanging fruit. There needs to be both monetary and regulatory incentives. And also we need to cultivate the political will of host countries, of seller countries, to retain the cheap mitigation options domestically. And for that, we need to have a transparent and predictable market environment that rewards these transformational impacts, in particular the SDGs. Thank you very much. Back to you, Axel.
Thank you very much, Stefan, on the transformation. And I think it's really crucial to get to grips with this long-term goal. I'll now pass to Philip, who will look into the experience from the past. Where do the CRs lie? Philip, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And there is the presentation. My name is Philip Zinskowski from Perspectives Climate Research, and together with Regina and her team from the Zurich University of Applied Sciences this year, we have published a study on volumes and types of unused CERs funded by the Swedish Energy Agency. And CERs are certified emission reduction units, so the credit units used under the CDM, and in the CDM transition, the CER transition is one key element next to also the activity and the governance structure transition that are currently being discussed in the negotiations. And what we did is we compiled a new data set from official UNFCCC data as well as national registry data to find out how many CERs remain unused today. That means that they are being still held in the CDM registry or in national registries. And we did that to provide the negotiations with several options of restricting or also excluding CER use under carbon markets in the post-2020 NDC period. And so what we see here are 8 options that we, from the database that we put together, found. So the first option is that there's no restriction at all, which means that there are currently, we found that there are 955 CERs still being held in the CDM registry, which is about 400, and the rest in million CERs in the CDM registry or in national registry. So yeah, you see here on the y-axis, you see the volumes of unused CERs, and on the x-axis, the options for negotiations. One can restrict then the transition of CERs, for instance, by project type, by cutoff date. This is currently the most likely option, that there will be a restriction by cutoff date. By type of holdings, so whether it's in the CDMR holding or in national registry holdings, or applying a quantitative limit to the CER transition, which has, for instance, been already applied for carryover of units between CP1, so commitment period 1, and CP2. And we see here that if, for instance, one would not include industrial gases like HFCs and N2Os, the volume of CERs would drop to 716 million. If a cutoff date of all activities that issued units would be set for the end of 2008, it would drop to 596 million unused CERs that would remain eligible for the post-2020 period. If, for instance, only the CDMR holdings that now have not yet been transferred onto national registries been eligible for the transition, we would have 401 million CERs. And now, the more recent cutoff dates that are actually now the more likely option from what we hear from the current negotiations, we would see a significant drop in the volumes of unused CERs. For instance, end of 2013, we find that we have only 25 million CERs, unused CERs that could be used in the post-2020 period. If it would be end of January 2016, we would only have 9 million CERs. And one alternative policy option that there is, as I explained, that was already applied in CP1, is the carryover with a quantitative restriction. For instance, here we illustrated this option with a percentage of 2.5%, and then we would have 16 million CERs. And clearly, also there's an option with no transition at all. So we then looked in our database, which is a novel database, since we also have the project level data of the CER units, which means we could look at the type of projects, we could look at the origins, and could find out really what and who would be impacted by which transition option. First of all, yeah, it is important to realize that until now, only 55% of all issued CERs, which at the end of last year were about 2 billion, were used. So were used for retiring or for cancellation purposes. And that means that the bulk of CERs that we see today or like a big part of the CERs that we have still available today is unused, and yeah, these CERs mostly come from the period between 2008 and 2013. Among those unused CERs, the project types that dominate are hydro and wind, the majority of which comes from large-scale projects, and then from N2O and HFC abatement, which we saw that from those projects, 20% remain unused, and they would be excluded if a cutoff date would be selected for 2013 or 2016. Then other projects that figure within those that are unused are energy efficiency in households, solar energy, where we see a high percentage in unused CERs, also from the industry sector activities and biomass projects. Then we see that types from the oil and gas sector have a higher than average share of unused CERs, also in fugitive coal mine, methane, and landfill gas projects. And we also see that those countries that hosted projects that issued CERs that today are unused are mostly Brazil, China, and India. And this is why India would be relatively less affected by a late cutoff date. And this is why we looked at the different countries in our study to see and find out which countries would be most affected. As I mentioned, there are also alternative restriction options. So, for instance, limiting the transition to the CERs that today remain in the CDM registry. This would more or less halve the total amount of unused CERs remaining, which would mean that if only those CERs would be allowed, the share of proceeds would still need to be paid upon transfer to National One registries. Then there's this option with applying a quantitative limit. This would put host countries really into the driving seat. And then there's obviously the question what to do with ineligible CERs, mandatory cancellation, which proved challenging in the past, which can be discussed later, and CER trading for other purposes, which is also something that remains to be seen. So then what we also to conclude, what we really see now in light of the new carbon markets under the Paris Agreement is that we need more transparency and more regulatory certainty because of this very patchy landscape of public information that we saw whilst we wrote the study, where we had very incomparable sources of information, for instance, with the cutoff dates at the official UNFCCC data and the national registry data often use different cutoff date because national registries have different national legislations, which made the sources sometimes very difficult to compare. And this is why for the Paris Agreement era, we suggest that the public disclosure of such data should be mandatory after a certain period, for instance, 3 years after the cancellation or retirement. Data should be traceable to the underlying activity at all times, which is possible also in the context of the confidentiality discussion. For instance, when account holders and or the buyers as well are anonymized. And the new Article 6.4 mechanism registry should also publish data on holding accounts after a given period. And what would be very useful also for research entities in the civil society is if there were more granular reporting guidelines and rules on the different uses on the different final uses of CERs, for instance, the voluntary cancellation and other purposes. There's a lack of streamlining of definitions. And this is why we really see that for the next carbon market period, we need regulatory certainty, also for the investment certainty, clear timelines to conclude now the carryover process, and clearly the eligibility criteria of CERs that can be carried over, and the avoidance of zombie units, which we found as units that stem from the commitment period 1, and that still lie in national registries, although they should have been cancelled under the rules of the Kyoto Protocol. Yes, and with this, I thank you, and you can find the study on our website, and I pass the word back to Axel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for this really groundwork in digging in registries, and I can tell you it was really tough, long work. All colleagues were sweating, and we were thinking, the actual main result of the study is that transparency of the information on CDM was really bad and that it should be improved under Article 6. So with that, I would now pass on to the Vietnamese colleagues. Cuong, you have the floor.
Thank you, Axel, for your kind introductions. So my name is Cuong. I'm currently working in the Department of Climate Change in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment in Vietnam. Coming back to last week, we all agree that the carbon pricing and also the carbon market plays an important role in our effort responding to climate change, and also in the mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions. I think this has been echoed by many speeches at the high-level segment from Germany or from Canada and many other countries. Today I would like to introduce to the development of the Vietnam carbon market, our experience and our way forward. So the first and most important thing is that Vietnam have reviewed and updated our NDC and submit to the UNFCCC in 2020. The process started quite early in 2018. Firstly, we identify potential sector for the mitigation and reductions of GHG, namely the 5 key sectors in energy, waste, LULUCF, agriculture, and industrial process. Then we hold a widespread consultations with different stakeholders from at the central level, the key ministry in the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Industry and Trade, Ministry of Transport, and other key ministry, and also with the NGO, with the private sector, and also with the support from the international development partner. Then we propose and we conclude the 2 commitment targets for Vietnam. The first one is the unconditional target that we commit to reduce by 9% in 2020 compared to the business as usual scenario. And the second one is the conditional target that we commit to reduce up to 27% in 2030 compared to the business as usual scenario with the international support and through the implementations of the bilateral and also multilateral mechanism under the Paris Agreement. In this case, the mechanism under the Article 6. And more importantly, last week, the Prime Minister of Vietnam, Phạm Minh Chính, at the high-level segment of the COP26, he made a historic landmark about a new commitment toward the fulfillment of the target under the Paris Agreement that we commit to reach a net zero emission by 2050. This is a historic and most ambitious landmark statement so far, and it provides us with the opportunity to further enhance our ambition in our NDC in the next circle, and also to provide the opportunity to further develop our carbon market. So what we have to do right now is to translate the commitment in international community, also with the political statement, into our political framework. And that's what we have been doing so far. So here you can see at the top level, we have the resolutions from the party central committee, and also with the political bureau, and also many at the top level political. We have the resolutions with layout, the orientation, with the direction to respond to climate change, to adapt to climate change. Also at the lower level, we have a series of law which provide the guidance and regulations to respond to climate change. The most important and the most recently is the law on the environmental protections, which we revised in 2020, among which we have a specific chapter on the climate change, and also a separate article on the development of the carbon market. And to provide the regulations and to provide more detailed regulations, we also have a series of legislations in terms of the decree, of strategies, of plan. On the left-hand side, I think we have the 2 most important key documents coming out within this year. The first one is the government decree on the GHG reductions and also the ozone layer protections. In that, we have three main content. The first one is obviously the GHG reductions. The second one is the development of the carbon market in Vietnam. And the last is the ozone layer protections. In that decree, we set out a series of regulation of timeline in order to meet our target in our NDC. We also identify a large greenhouse gas emitter in several sectors, in energy, in waste, in building, so that they have to conduct their inventory and also to develop their mitigation plan. And so based on that, we're going to adopt a scheme to develop the carbon market in Vietnam, which will be soon submitted to the Prime Minister to be adopted in 2021, this year. What defines the Vietnam carbon market? I think we all agree on the importance of the carbon market in mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions. But I think the most important aspect of the carbon market is that we can reduce the greenhouse gas at a low cost, not only to business but also to society in general. Also, we can through the carbon market we can promote the development of the low emission technology, and also to contributing to the improving the competitiveness of the Vietnam's private sector, especially if you consider the many proposed current the trade agreement with the European Union that require to have the carbon pricing in the export sector. So in the carbon market in Vietnam, we identify three main components. The first one is the emission trading scheme, which we will implement to the cap and trade. So all the large GHG emitter, based on their inventory result and also based on their mitigation plan, the government will we allocate the cap, and then we will be traded on the domestic market. The second component is the national crediting program, which will encourage the domestic project developer and also to promote the companies who soon invest in the new technology to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, so that they will be able to generate credit to participate and also to supplement in our emission trading scheme. Last but not least is the international crediting mechanisms, which include all the mechanisms under Article 6, 6.2, 6.4, also other voluntary mechanisms under many international mechanisms. I think we are still a long way to go to reach our target to be able to implement the emission trading scheme, also the national crediting program. But we do have some experience in implementing the mechanisms with the international partner. The first one is the Clean Development Mechanism, or the CDM. I think Vietnam is one of the countries that very actively participate in the CDM. We have in general about more than 250 projects and also more than 10 programs of activities currently conducted in the CDM. For the CDM project portfolio in Vietnam, previously we mostly focus on the two kind of projects. The first one is the hydro, and the second one is the associated gas, which extract from the oil extraction factory and can be used to generate power. In terms of the registered CDM projects and also the credit, Vietnam currently ranked fourth in the world. So I think back to the previous presentations by our speaker, the transition of the CDM projects into the new periods play a very key important role in our effort in reducing the greenhouse gas and also in the achieving the NDC target. We must identify which type of project, which type of credit can be able to be moved forward into the next period, so that we can both protect the benefit of the project developer, but also to be able to contribute to the achievement of the goal under the Paris Agreement. I think the CDMs, I think we do have some experience in CDM, and then this can be laid the foundation to Vietnam participant in the later stage in order to implement the article under the mechanism under the Article 6.4. Related to the bilateral cooperations, we do have experience with the cooperation with the Japanese government. Since 2030, the Vietnamese government and the Japanese government signed a memorandum of cooperation to promote the carbon growth technologies in order to achieve the NDC from both sides. The basic concept under the joint creating mechanism is that a Vietnamese company will partner up with a Japanese company in order to form a consortium, and then they will submit to project idea and then a project guideline to the Japanese government to secure the funding in order to transfer the new technology from Japan and also to implement the project that will reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So far we have 14 registered projects, and then 6 projects have been monitored, verified, and issued carbon credit, and around 4,000 carbon credits have been issued. Maybe compared to the CDM, the number of registered projects and also the credit are not much, but it allows us, especially the policymaker and also at the government, at the management stage, to have some experience with implementing the bilateral mechanisms so that we can move forward, especially related to the bilateral cooperations under the 6.2. Also, other from CDM, from the JCM joint creating mechanism, Vietnam project developer also have experience with other creating mechanism as well, especially related to the voluntary mechanism in the gold standard, in verified carbon standard, and also in a renewable energy certificate. Most recently, the Vietnamese government also signed emission reduction payment agreement with the World Bank, with the goal of reducing about 10 million carbon CO2 equivalent under in the forestry sector. I think all the experience in the CDM, in the JCM, and also in other mechanisms set out a very good foundation in order for us to implement the emission reduction activity in the future, and also to participate in the international carbon market. But not only from the experience from outside, we do receive a lot of support from other development partners as well. I think the most important partners from outside is the World Bank. They have been working with the government of Vietnam since 2015 in the Partnership for Market Readiness, or the PMR. And then we are moving to the next stage, the PMI, the Partnership for Market Implementations for the next period. So the activities between two sides focus on the 2 key pillars. The first one is to strengthening the capacity to developing the carbon pricing approach to identify which carbon pricing instrument most suitable to Vietnam. And also the second thing is to provide the technical support in order to improve the readiness to pilot. And we managed to identify 2 potential sectors to pilot in the future, namely the steel productions and also the waste. Another key important outcome of the project under the PMR was that we managed to incorporate our result into the law on the environmental protections in 2020, that we will set out a roadmap to develop the carbon market in Vietnam in the future. Another key important partner have been supporting Vietnam in developing the carbon market is the Asian Development Bank, the ADB. They have been provide support to Vietnam to the Article 6 support facility, namely in 2 key components. The first one is the policy support, mostly in reviewing and also in developing the recommendation in order to be able to pilot project under the Article 6. And also the second one is the capacity building for relevant stakeholders, including the board policy maker and also to the project developer, in order to enhance their readiness to implement the Article 6. So with the experience of implementing the mechanisms and also with the international support, we identified the roadmap in order to be able to develop the carbon market to implement the ETS, the National Creating Program. So we identified 2 key landmarks. The first one is 2025, and the second one is 2030. So for the first period from now to 2025, we identified 5 key objectives. The first one is to establish the information and also the data system. We need to collect the greenhouse gas inventory from the facility level, and also we need to develop our technical infrastructure, maybe in terms of the registry or also the trading platform. so that we intend to pilot the emission trading scheme in 2025. Alongside with that, we also will develop the guidance to implement the national grading program and also the guideline for the implementation of the project under the international mechanisms. Last but not least is the capacity building for the business and relevant stakeholder, because the idea of the trading in the carbon market is quite new to many business and also to the private sector in general. And the second period from 2026 to 2030, the first landmark will be somewhere around 2027, will be the official launching of the emission trading scheme. And also during that period, we will working to network with other countries in the regions, also with the international carbon market, so that we can connect our emission trading scheme, our market with the regional and also with the international carbon market. So there are lots of work to do from now until 2030, and a lot of landmarks to be filled. So in order to do that, we identify 4 key components as a way to move forward. The first one is we will have to finalize our institutional and also the policy framework. Even we had some foundation in terms of law, in terms of decree related to the development of the carbon market, but a lot of technical guidance in terms of MRV, in terms of the guideline to develop the projects has to be finalized. The second one is to invest to promote the research and development, especially consider the context that the digitalizations and also the 4.0 industry, the 4.0 achievement, and play a key important role in that to facilitate and also to quicken the process of developing our carbon market. The third key point is the capacity building and raising awareness. As I mentioned before, not many business and also private sector had a key idea or a clear idea about the carbon market or about the benefit of the trading in the carbon market. So that's we have to implement a national-wide program to raise awareness, to enhance our capacity building of different sector, of different stakeholders, so that they can they can actively participate in our carbon market. And I think the key thing and then the most important thing is to promote the international cooperations, because the carbon market we do have experience. This is still new and a lot of work to do. So we do need to share experience with other countries, with other different partners, and also we looking forward to the support from other partners as well, so that we can join hands together and then we can implement and participate in the international carbon market. So that concludes my slide. Thank you very much. And back to you, Asa.
Yes, thank you very much, Cuong. And it's impressive to see the elaboration of the strategy on various levels. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the results over the decade that has just started. With that, I would now like to pass to Karen, who will give us a short glimpse into work that just started on dynamic baseline development. Karen, you have the floor.
Thank you. I will keep it brief and just introduce what we plan to do for capacity building support to determine a dynamic baseline in Vietnam. It builds on support which is already ongoing under the ICAT Initiative for Climate Action and Transparency, where we have supported Vietnam since 2019 to set up, build capacity at sector level for establishing the MRV system in the energy sector, energy and agriculture sectors. But here the example we will use for the study is the solar PV policy in the energy sector, and then apply the dynamic baseline concept to see how you could attract results-based carbon finance for NDC ambition raising, as explained by Stefan. This is the context for doing it. So just a little bit on the concept and how a dynamic baseline could address the challenge to raise NDC ambition. The challenge is
develop carbon credits with integrity. And there's both a static challenge within the NDC period, no double counting, and there's also the dynamic challenge, as Stefan also explained, to align the baseline with the long-term pathway to net zero, or whatever the NDC says. But the question is, for a dynamic baseline, where would you situate the baseline to be Paris compatible, which we know science says is net zero at some point, but country specific, what is that time for net zero? But eventually we would all have to go there for the global goals to be achieved. But the question is for Vietnam and at the sector level, how would you downscale such a Paris-aligned pathway to the national level and to the sector level and to the activity level? So here you see the red circle these are the options. So how steep would your baseline go to net zero? Would we align with a conditional NDC target? Would it be well below 2 degrees? Would it be highest possible ambition, or would it be 1.5 degree compatible pathway? So we don't have the answers yet, but these are the questions for how to do the study on a dynamic baseline. And what we intend to do for capacity building support, working with the Center for Ozone Layer Protection, CCO Zone, and Ministry, Mr. Tam. We will do additional activities to what we've already done on MRV. And this also relates to how would you then report and account for this under the ETF? So we will do a report on the reporting aspects, the guidance we have from the ETF, table formats on how to do ITNO accounting under the 6.2. And also what we already did was to identify indicators to track progress of NDC implementation. But then we would, based on the solar PV policy, where we would do the dynamic baseline, we would take it as a case study. It's a research. It's not for crediting, it's just research for now. And then we will make the results available. And you can already see some results on the ICAT website. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karen, and I'm really looking forward to the outcomes of this study. Now, last but not least, Arunabha Ghosh from India. They have developed a really interesting report on CDM transition. Arunabha, you have the floor for your short summary on your key outcomes.
Thank you very much, Axel, and good day to everybody. I know I have very little time, so first of all, I want to congratulate the work that Perspectives is doing. I think the study on looking at the volumes and types of various types of unused certified emissions reductions is extremely important, because it's that body of work that helps us transition from a very contentious issue towards something that can get us into a post-2020 mechanism. It presents an authoritative update on the current status of issued, used, and unused CERs, and provides a basis for further analysis on the topic of CERs transition. Moreover, it provides, in my opinion, specific and actionable options for negotiators. Those various 8 options that we saw for the transition to Article 6. Sectoral approach, the vintage, the geographical restrictions, and so forth, in order to provide a balanced demand-supply transition under Article 6.4. However, the disconnect between the estimates of unsold CERs based on sort of top-down approaches, subtracting the CERs cancelled and retired from cumulative CERs from a particular given cutoff date, and the bottom-up approach, which is examining the holdings in the CDM registry and the national registries, is indicative of a lack of transparency and traceability in the current reporting system. And this is why so many of our colleagues here on this panel have emphasized the need to have much more credible monitoring and accounting of the activities. Which brings me, in the remaining 1.5 minutes that I have, the opportunity to present to you what at CEW, my colleague Arjun Dutt and others have been looking at, is there a way to take us from this overhang of CERs into a world that opens up the Article 6.4 mechanism? The volume of unsold CERs, the 0.4 billion or 400 million unsold CERs that came from this study, is something that we have used at CEW to put forward our proposal, where we see that, of course, there are one set of countries that want the full transition of the CERs, and there's another set of countries that oppose this. In our estimation, the count of unsold and unissued CERs is about 3.91 billion. Now, what do you do when you have such a large stock of unsold or unissued CERs? Our suggestion is that we can break the deadlock in the negotiations by a two-way kind of compromise. On one side, countries that want the transition say that, well, fine, we will not transition the CERs into the post-2020 market. But on the other side, countries, a different set of countries, pays for this overhang. And our estimation is that it will cost somewhere in the order of about $11.7 billion, using a $3 per unit compensation price, which would be a weighted average of the price of carbon offsets in voluntary markets currently. Now, will this work? We don't know, but the point is, until and unless we're able to find the climate financing to pay off for this overhang of unsold CERs, we will not manage to create the kind of much more dynamic, credible, monitored, and much more expansive market going forward. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arunabha, for this passionate plea. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting suggestion. And let's hope that negotiators will take at least part of it. Now we have 9 minutes for your questions, comments from the floor. You see the 4 microphones in the walkways. I would now ask anyone to raise the hand and walk up to the microphone and ask questions, comments in the remaining, now 8.5 minutes. Please, floor is open. Well, if there is, Regina, please.
So I have a question to the colleagues from Vietnam. You were showing that there will be so many different emissions trading, like cap and trade, national baseline and credit, international. So how will you decide, if there's an international project developer coming, if there's a national one, do you have any decision process? Who's going to be able to invest and get the credits?
Yeah, thank you. Please, Tan or Cuong, who wants to give a comment? Cuong, please.
Thank you, Regina. So I think to be able to come out with the decisions on which carbon pricing, which type of carbon market, or the ETS, or the cap and trade, or the baseline credit to be implemented in Vietnam, we have a long way to go. So we receive some support from the PMA, from the World Bank. So they identify which are the most suitable mechanisms, which suitable carbon pricing option to be implemented. So for example, like for energy sector, I think the ETS will be the most suitable. But for other sector which have the capacity to mitigate a lot of GHG, so we be able to implement the national crediting mechanisms. But also we want to encourage the cooperation with other partners as well, also to attract the investment from different countries. So that's why we also want to implement the international crediting mechanisms.
Thank you. I see, yes, please. We have microphone number 3. Give your name and institution and then the question.
Sure. My name is Michaela and I'm from Indiana University in the United States. And I was wondering if any panelists could speak to a successful characteristic of Article 6 that could address the issue within the CDM of sort of less developed countries attracting some attention for climate financing compared to the more emerging economies that tended to attract most of that prior.
Yes, thank you. Who wants to take that up? How can we get a more equitable, Stefan, maybe?
Yes, so I think I also mentioned the need for differentiation. So I mean, if you look at specifically the carbon markets itself, we need to make sure that the rules for how to generate carbon credits cater to the circumstances of the less developed countries. But then we also need to, of course, have, you know, a more differentiated price segment for those more difficult projects that are more decentralized, more community-based. And I think one can maybe sum that up with, you know, there needs to be a willingness to pay for those more difficult projects. That's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer, that there is, of course, also some sort of political direction, you know, how climate finance is provided. We often have the distinction between mitigation and adaptation, but sometimes also there's some geographical notion in there. So I do think it's clear this is a political thing, providing climate finance to vulnerable countries, and therefore it requires the requisite attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Microphone number 4, please.
Yes, hello. I'm Florentine Koppenborg from the Technical University Munich. And first of all, thank you for all these insightful presentations. And my question, I guess, mainly goes to Robert Senskovsky. Because first of all, I want to say really kudos to that research, because I've tried only tracking Japan's investments in Southeast Asia. And the data transparency was so bad that it was scaled down from a planned huge project to one paper. And I really liked your recommendations for Article 6 and the Paris Agreement, because many of those things I had found back when I was doing that research. And actually the question is simple. So to you, Robert, and the others, if you look at the current trajectory and progress of negotiations, what's your take on that, given, like, in light of your recommendations?
Philip, do you want to get a stab at that?
Yes, so no, thanks a lot for this question. I think this is really, really important. I think the negotiations are going well in that sense that transparency is really something that is under Article 13 really discussed to a much greater extent, and the idea of really being able to track units at all times in this centralized Article 6.4 registry, it's on the table. It is not yet finalized, but I think parties know what it is about, and we know that today we also have more technological options to actually do this tracking and reporting of units via blockchain, for instance, blockchain solutions. There's a working group at the World Bank who's doing some research on that, where you could really combine this need for confidentiality on the side of the project developers and countries, buyers, together with this need for at any time and from anywhere in the world being able to track these units. And indeed, with Japan, we had the luck that within our team of researchers, we had informal contacts to the national registries. Without this, we would have not been able to get to the project level information.
Regina, maybe you want to add, because I think you've been digging very deep there.
Yeah, maybe to add, I mean, what I really don't understand is, I mean, we have this international transaction log, which sits with the Secretariat, which knows where, or hopefully knows, where all the units are. And I don't really understand why they can't make it public. I remember I was negotiating on the registries, and we were pushing hard, and I just don't understand why it's not made publicly available, at least like 3 years after. So that's something I think we could have right now, and I hope they will be able to ensure that this will be under Article 6. I mean, it would be very simple. I mean, they should have the data. Otherwise, I mean, there's no trust in the market where not even the Secretariat knows where the CRs are.
Thank you. Last question, Matthias, please.
Yes, Matthias Honecker. Given that markets in general are such an issue for public trust and really there seems to be a lot of skepticism out there, what if you have a one-line sort of narrative, how would you characterize where we're at and what needs to happen and why? Thank you.
Okay, that is a big ask. Anyone who would like to try the one line?
We don't know what we were doing, and because of that, we don't know where we are going.
Well, that is a rather pessimistic one. Regina?
We need oversight, really oversight. We have all the technology to look at big data. We would be able to come up with algorithms to find out what's going on wrong and so on. But we need resources and oversight and the willingness, the political willingness to do that.
Thank you. We are almost done, so I would like to thank the panel for being very disciplined. We had a really difficult task, but we fulfilled it nicely. I hope you saw that the whole event was structured coming from the broad to the very specific. So watch our websites for further research coming. And of course, also congratulations to the government of Vietnam for having their roadmap. And we are happy to contribute also to fulfillment of that roadmap. So thank you very much and have a nice rest of the day.